In the silent, frozen forest clearing where the only sound is the cracking of frost-covered branches until the very earth begins to groan under the weight of 80 tons of Soviet steel. From the dark tree line, a massive 8-wheeled transporter erector launcher emerges, its tires churning through the deep mud as it takes its position with the mechanical precision of a clockwork toy. Within exactly 5 minutes, the vehicle stops, hydraulic jacks bite into the soil, and 4 gargantuan green canisters are raised toward the leaden sky, pointing like the fingers of a vengeful god. Then comes the moment that has haunted the nightmares of every Western combat pilot for half a century. A sharp metallic thud, a sudden eruption of cold gas, and a 2-ton missile is catapulted 30 meters into the air, tumbling momentarily in the silence before its main engine ignites with a roar that shatters every window for miles and sends the interceptor screaming toward the edge of space. This is the S-300, a weapon system so shrouded in mystery that for decades, United States intelligence agencies could only guess at its true lethality, whispering rumors of a radar that could see a single bird at the horizon and a digital brain that could coordinate the destruction of an entire air force without a human being ever pulling a trigger. But the birth of this legend was not a clean march of technological progress. It was a desperate, high-stakes gamble born from the humiliation of the Vietnam War, a bitter blood feud between 2 of the Soviet Union's most brilliant engineering minds, and a technical challenge that many high-ranking generals believed was a physical impossibility.
To understand why the S-300 had to exist, we must travel back to the humid, smoke-choked jungles of North Vietnam in the mid-1960s, where the first generation of Soviet surface-to-air missiles was facing its ultimate trial by fire. The legendary S-75, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline, had initially shocked the world by downing Francis Gary Powers and his high-flying U-2 spy plane. But by 1965, the Americans were proving to be incredibly fast learners. United States Air Force pilots were perfecting the art of the wild weasel, flying specialized jets equipped with sensors that could sniff out Soviet radar signals and home in on them with Shrike anti-radiation missiles. Even more terrifying for the Soviet advisors on the ground was the American mastery of electronic warfare. Giant EB-66 jamming aircraft could flood the sky with so much electronic noise that the Soviet radar screens turned into a useless blizzard of white static. The Soviet leadership in Moscow watched with growing horror as their entire air defense network, built at the cost of tens of billions of rubles, was becoming an obsolete collection of scrap metal. The threat was no longer just the massive high-altitude bombers they had prepared for. It was now a swarm of low-flying strike fighters and the emerging threat of cruise missiles that could hide in the radar shadows of hills and valleys, slipping through the gaps like water through a sieve. By 1967, the situation had reached a boiling point in the Kremlin, leading to a decree that sounded more like a fever dream than a military requirement. The Ministry of Defense demanded a single universal air defense system that could protect the Army on the move, the Navy at sea, and the strategic cities of the motherland against every conceivable aerial threat, from supersonic interceptors to tiny low-altitude cruise missiles. This project was given the designation S-300, but behind the closed doors of the design bureaus, a civil war was already erupting between 2 of the most powerful men in the Soviet military-industrial complex. On one side stood Boris Bunkin, the head of the Almaz Bureau, a man of quiet intensity who believed that the future of war lay in centralized, highly sophisticated electronics. On the other side was Veniamin Efremov, the leader of the Ante Bureau, a specialist in mobile systems for the ground forces who favored ruggedness and raw power over delicate complexity. These two titans of engineering had fundamentally different visions of what the S-300 should be, and their inability to reach a compromise would lead the Soviet Union into one of the most expensive and complex parallel development programs in the history of human conflict.
Boris Bunkin knew that the era of the spinning radar dish was dead. To catch a target moving at 3 times the speed of sound at an altitude of only 50 meters, he needed a phased array radar, a technology that used thousands of tiny stationary elements to steer a radio beam electronically at the speed of light. In the early 1970s, this was the technological equivalent of trying to build a quantum computer using nothing but vacuum tubes and hope. The engineering team at Almaz worked in a state of permanent exhaustion, fueled by endless pots of black tea and the constant fear of falling behind the Americans, who were already developing their own advanced system known as the Patriot. Bunkin often slept in his office, his desk buried under mountains of blueprints and failed circuit boards, knowing that if he could not figure out how to process the massive amounts of data required to track 100 targets simultaneously, his career and the safety of the Soviet Union would be over. The technical hurdles were staggering. The Soviet electronics industry simply did not have the capability to produce the high-precision phase shifters required for the radar antenna, leading Bunkin to invent entirely new manufacturing processes on the fly. But the real nightmare began when the designers realized that a single universal system was a fantasy that the laws of physics would not permit. The Army needed a system that could survive being rattled across thousands of kilometers of Siberian wasteland on tracked chassis, while the Navy needed a system that could withstand the corrosive salt spray of the open ocean and fit into the cramped hulls of cruisers. The Air Defense Forces, meanwhile, wanted something that could be mass-produced to cover the vast borders of the Soviet Union. The result was a split that would define the program for decades: the S-300P for the Air Defense Forces, the S-300V for the Army, and the S-300F for the Navy. Each bureau began a frantic race to see who could deliver their version first, and the cost to the Soviet treasury began to spiral into the hundreds of billions of rubles. Every time a new technological breakthrough was made at Almaz, the Ante Bureau would demand the same resources, leading to a massive duplication of effort that only the Soviet command economy could have sustained. While Bunkin wrestled with the ghosts in the machines at Almaz, Veniamin Efremov at the Ante Bureau was facing a different set of nightmares. His version of the system, the S-300V, was designed to intercept tactical ballistic missiles falling from the edge of space at several kilometers per second. This required a level of structural strength and motor performance that pushed Soviet metallurgy to its absolute breaking point. While Bunkin focused on the elegance of the signal, Efremov focused on the brutality of the environment, ensuring that his launchers could be rattled across thousands of kilometers of Siberian wasteland and still function perfectly the moment a Pershing missile appeared on the horizon. The ideological rift between the two bureaus became so deep that the Soviet government eventually gave up on the idea of a universal system, allowing both men to build their own separate versions of the S-300 at a cost that would have bankrupted a smaller nation. One of the most radical and dangerous decisions made during the design phase was the move to a vertical launch system. Before the S-300, every missile launcher had to be physically rotated and tilted toward the incoming target, a process that took precious seconds that the Soviet generals knew they would not have in a Third World War. Bunkin and Efremov envisioned a system where the missile would be fired straight up and then tilt toward the target in mid-air, but this created a terrifying engineering paradox. If you ignited a massive solid-fuel rocket motor inside a launch tube, the incredible heat and pressure would instantly melt the launcher and fry the millions of rubles worth of electronics inside. The solution was the cold start, a method where a powerful gas generator would blast the missile out of the tube like a piston in an engine.
Only when the multi-ton missile was 30 meters above the ground would the main motor ignite. During early tests at the Sari-Shagan range, this process was anything but smooth. There were heart-stopping moments where the gas generator would fail to provide enough lift, and a 40-foot missile would be tossed into the air only to fall back toward the launch vehicle like a giant explosive hammer, sending the design teams scrambling for the bunkers. The heart of the S-300 system was the 30N6 radar, a massive, flat slab of electronics that looked less like a weapon and more like a gateway to another dimension. Unlike previous radars that could be blinded by a single American jamming aircraft, the phased array of the S-300 was nearly impossible to confuse. It used a digital brain to constantly shift its frequency and beam shape, filtering out the electronic noise and zeroing in on real targets with the cold persistence of a shark. However, the sheer complexity of this digital brain led to a series of cascading problems during the mid-1970s. The Soviet microchip industry was in its infancy, and the failure rate for the advanced components needed for the radar was nearly 90%. Bunkin's engineers had to manually test every single component, often finding that only a handful out of 1,000 met the required specifications. This led to massive delays, and by 1975, the project was years behind schedule, leading to intense scrutiny from the KGB and the Central Committee. As the testing dragged on in the scorched deserts of Kazakhstan, the human drama behind the S-300 reached a fever pitch. The Soviet generals were in a state of near-constant panic because the Americans had just introduced the Tomahawk cruise missile, a weapon that could fly beneath the radar at treetop level and deliver a nuclear warhead to the center of Moscow with the accuracy of a sniper. The pressure on Bunkin and Efremov was immense. They were summoned to the Kremlin and told in no uncertain terms that if the S-300 did not become operational soon, there would be severe consequences for everyone involved. Boris Bunkin, a man who had spent his entire life dedicated to the defense of the state, found himself caught between the impossible demands of his political masters and the stubborn laws of physics. He had to explain to men who only understood brute force that a computer could not be bullied into working faster, and that the millions of lines of code required to automate the air defense of an entire continent were a work of art that could not be rushed. The scenes at the Sari-Shagan testing grounds were like something out of a cinematic epic. The heat was so intense that the metal of the launchers would expand, causing the delicate internal mechanisms to jam. Engineers worked through the night under floodlights, their hands covered in grease and desert dust, trying to recalibrate sensors that had been shaken loose by the violent vibrations of the massive MAZ transporters. When the first successful full-scale intercept finally occurred, it wasn't a moment of cheering and celebration, but one of profound relief. A target drone, flying at twice the speed of sound and mimicking the profile of an American fighter, was obliterated by a 5V-55 missile so far away that the observers on the ground could only see a tiny flash on their radar screens. The system had worked. The invisible shield was finally real. But even after the first successful tests, the project was nearly buried by a bureaucratic nightmare. High-ranking officials in the Ministry of Radio Industry argued that the system was too complex to be maintained by ordinary conscript soldiers. They pointed to the massive racks of computers and the delicate cooling systems, claiming that a single drop of condensation or a bit of dust would render the entire battery useless in a real war. Bunkin had to prove them wrong by subjecting the S-300 to a series of brutal endurance tests. He ordered a battery to be driven thousands of kilometers across the frozen tundra and then immediately fired into a simulated combat environment. The machines groaned, the electronics hummed at the edge of their capacity, but they held together. This resilience became the hallmark of the system, a testament to the Soviet philosophy of building high-tech weapons with the durability of a tractor. When the S-300 finally entered service in 1978, it changed the landscape of global security overnight. It was initially so heavy and complex that it required hours to set up, but the engineers quickly pivoted to a fully mobile version mounted on the massive 8-wheeled MAZ-7910 tractor. This gave birth to the 5-minute rule, a standard that is still the benchmark for air defense today. A battery of S-300s could be driving down a highway at 60 kilometers per hour, receive a contact, and be fully deployed with missiles in the air in exactly 300 seconds. This mobility turned the Soviet air defense network into a ghost. By the time an enemy strike package reached the coordinates where a radar had been detected, the S-300 was already 5 kilometers away, hidden under a camouflage net in a new forest clearing, ready to fire again. This cat-and-mouse game meant that any attempt to suppress the Soviet air defenses would be a suicide mission for even the most skilled pilots. The economic contrast of the S-300 program was staggering, even by the standards of the Soviet Union. The cost of a single fully equipped battery was equivalent to the production of over 50 T-72 tanks or an entire fleet of interceptor aircraft. Each individual missile was a masterpiece of precision engineering, containing more computing power than the entire Soviet space program had possessed a decade earlier. The resources diverted to this project meant that other areas of the military had to make do with less, but the Soviet leadership viewed the S-300 as a non-negotiable insurance policy. To them, the ability to protect their nuclear silos and command centers from a preemptive American strike was worth any price. It was a weapon designed for a war that could never be won, yet its presence was intended to ensure that such a war would never be fought.
The comparison between the S-300 and the American Patriot system became a point of intense technical debate that lasted for decades. While the Patriot was a formidable weapon, the Soviet system had several key advantages that reflected a different philosophy of war. Because the S-300 fired its missiles vertically, it had a full 360-degree engagement zone, whereas the early Patriot launchers had to be physically turned to face the direction of the threat. Furthermore, the Soviet missiles used a more powerful solid-fuel motor that gave them a significantly longer range and a higher top speed, allowing them to engage targets before the enemy even realized they were being tracked. However, the Patriot benefited from the superior American microchip industry, giving it a more refined software interface. This technological rivalry was a mirror of the Cold War itself, American finesse versus Soviet brute force ingenuity. As the 1980s drew to a close, the S-300 was constantly being upgraded to stay ahead of Western developments. The introduction of the S-300 PMU variants brought even more advanced radars and longer-range missiles, capable of hitting targets nearly 150 kilometers away. But as the technical power of the system grew, the country that built it began to fracture. The engineers at Almaz and Ante found themselves working in factories where the heating was turned off and the salaries hadn't been paid in months. In one of the most poignant moments of the era, the very men who had designed the most advanced air defense system on the planet had to sell spare parts and office furniture just to buy food for their families. Yet, even in the midst of this collapse, the S-300 remained a point of immense national pride, a symbol of what the Soviet Union could achieve when it focused all its will on a single goal. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the secret of the S-300 was suddenly up for sale. To the absolute shock of Western military attachés, the newly independent states began showcasing the system at international arms fairs, offering it to any nation with enough hard currency. For years, the S-300 had been a ghost in the machinery of NATO planning, and now, for a few $1 million, Western experts could walk up and touch the very missiles they had feared for 20 years. When American engineers finally got their hands on components of the S-300 through third-party countries, they were stunned by what they found. They discovered a system that was far more rugged and reliable than their own, built with a philosophy that allowed it to sit in a shipping container in sub-zero temperatures for a decade and then fire with 100% reliability on the first attempt. The Soviet designers had not tried to mimic Western elegance. They had built a weapon that could survive the end of the world. The post-Cold War fate of the S-300 and its creators is a bittersweet irony. Boris Bunkin, the man who had spent his life building a shield for a country that no longer existed, lived to see his technology become the most sought-after military export in the world. He remained a respected figure in the Russian scientific community until his death in 2007, but he died in a world vastly different from the one he had tried to protect. His rival, Veniamin Efremov, also saw his tracked S-300V become a legend in its own right, proving that his focus on mobility and ballistic missile defense was decades ahead of its time. The two men who had fought so bitterly over the design of the system eventually saw their work merged into the next generation of air defense, the S-400, which combines the best of both their visions into a single, terrifyingly effective platform.
The geopolitical impact of the S-300 reached a fever pitch in the late 1990s during the Cyprus Missile Crisis. The Greek Cypriot government had ordered the system from Russia, a move that nearly sparked a war with Turkey. The Western powers were in an uproar. The idea of a NATO member like Turkey having to fly against the S-300 was a strategic nightmare. Eventually, the missiles were diverted to the island of Crete, where they remain to this day, becoming a strange curiosity, a Soviet-made shield protecting a NATO border. This incident proved that the S-300 was no longer just a weapon. It was a tool of high-stakes international diplomacy, a way for smaller nations to say no to the world's superpowers. The sheer physical presence of the system continues to command respect. If you walk through a modern Russian air defense base today, the S-300 units look less like military equipment and more like industrial infrastructure. The massive radar towers, some raised 40 meters into the air on specialized masts to see over forests, hum with a low-frequency vibration that you can feel in your teeth. The crews who operate them are a new breed of technical warriors, more comfortable with a keyboard than a rifle. Yet they are heirs to a tradition of defense that stretches back to the first days of the Cold War. They understand that their job is to be invisible until the very last second, a silent guardian that only makes its presence known when the sky begins to fall. The S-300 also found a new life in the digital age, where its complex algorithms were reverse-engineered and adapted for modern electronic warfare. The way the system manages its energy, focusing its radar beam like a scalpel to cut through the thickest jamming, is still studied by engineers around the world. It was a pioneer of the networked battlefield, where multiple batteries could share data in real time, creating a seamless web of fire that no single aircraft could penetrate. This legacy of connectivity paved the way for the integrated air defense systems we see today, where satellites, drones, and ground-based missiles work together in a single, terrifyingly efficient organism.
But for all its technical brilliance, the S-300 is ultimately a machine built by human hands and fueled by human ambition. It is a product of an era where two empires stood at the edge of the abyss, and thousands of men and women worked in secret cities to ensure their side would not be the first to blink. The cost of the system cannot just be measured in rubles or dollars. It must be measured in the lives of the engineers who worked themselves to death, the pilots who lived in fear of its radar lock, and the political leaders who used it as a pawn in a global game of chess. It is a heavy legacy, one that sits on the shoulders of every soldier who stands watch over the launch tubes today. If you visit a military museum today and stand next to an S-300 launcher, the first thing that strikes you is the sheer, overwhelming scale of the machine. The tires are as tall as a grown man,
and the missile canisters loom overhead like the pillars of a cathedral. It is a haunting experience to touch the cold metal and realize that this single vehicle was designed to carry enough destructive power to wipe out an entire squadron of the world's most advanced aircraft. The S-300 is a monument to an era when humanity stood on the brink of total annihilation and responded by building the most sophisticated shields ever imagined. It is a reminder that in the world of military technology, the most important weapons are often the ones that are never fired in anger, because their very existence makes the cost of aggression too high to pay. The story of the S-300 is ultimately a story about the limits of power and the ingenuity of the human spirit when pushed to the edge of catastrophe. It was a project that should have failed, built by a country that was crumbling from within, yet it produced a technology that remains the gold standard for air defense half a century later. It proves that the most enduring legends of the Cold War were not just the spies and the politicians, but the engineers who turned impossible dreams into steel and fire. The S-300 did not save the Soviet Union, but it created a legacy of technical excellence that continues to shape the world we live in today. Every time a pilot checks his radar warning receiver or a general plots a path through enemy airspace, the ghost of Boris Bunkin and Veniamin Efremov is there, watching from the shadows of a forest clearing. As we look toward the future, the lessons of the S-300 remain as relevant as ever. In an age of hypersonic missiles and swarming drones, the need for a sophisticated, layered shield is only growing. The descendants of the S-300, the S-400, and the S-500 are pushing the boundaries of what is possible, reaching higher into the atmosphere and further into the horizon. But at their core, they all rely on the same principles of vertical launch, phased array technology, and cold starting that were forged in the desperation of the 1970s. The S-300 was the foundation upon which the modern concept of air defense was built, and its silhouette will remain a symbol of strategic defiance for generations to come. The technical specifications that were once the most guarded secrets of the Soviet Union are now common knowledge among military enthusiasts, yet they still fail to capture the true essence of the machine. You can speak of a 400-kilometer range or a Mach 6 speed, but those numbers don't tell you about the smell of ozone in the radar cabin or the way the ground shakes when the gas generator fires. They don't tell you about the silence that follows a successful intercept or the weight of responsibility that comes with having the power to end thousands of lives with the push of a button. The S-300 is a machine of contradictions, a weapon of peace, a high-tech relic, and a silent sentinel that continues to wait for a war that we can only hope never comes. If you found this chronicle of the S-300 as captivating as we did, please make sure to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the history of the world's most incredible machines. We put a tremendous amount of research into every script to bring you the hidden stories behind the hardware, and your support is what allows us to keep going. Let us know in the comments section which legendary tank, plane, or missile system you want to see us cover next, and we will see you in the next episode of our journey through the annals of military history. Every comment, every share, and every new subscriber helps us grow and continue producing the most detailed military history content on the platform. Thank you for watching and for being part of our community.